approximate will go with more than 100. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me at all.
Richard Leonard Kuklinski, the Iceman. "How many people have you killed?" the interviewer asked. The man casually shrugged, like he's been asked a mundane question, like, "What's your favorite color?" "Oh, an approximate guess," he started. He paused for a few seconds as if trying to count. "Approximately. I'll go with more than 100. His demeanor remained casual and detached. One might even say icy. This is the story of one of America's most notorious serial killers, Richard Leonard Kuklinski, and history will remember him notoriously as the Iceman, not only for his lack of remorse at committing multiple murders, but because of the unique way he chose to kill his many victims. Richard Kuklinski's double life as a great family man and as a proficient mafia hitman would go on to inspire 3 documentaries, 2 biographies, and a featured film, all based on the man known in criminal circles as the Devil himself. Born on April 11, 1935, Richard Kuklinski didn't have what many of us would describe as a picturesque childhood. Thanks in no small part to his father, Richard learned at an early age that violence was almost always the answer. His father was verbally and physically abusive to Richard and his siblings, and beatings for any stepping out of line were commonplace. Obviously, the elder Kuklinski left both a figurative and physical mark on his children, even going as far as beating one of his sons to death. Before age 11, Richard was accustomed to receiving beatings from his father, even describing him as a nasty person in one of his interviews. It didn't help that Mr. Kuklinski had an affinity for the bottle and sometimes punched and kicked his kids in a drunken rage. With so much physical violence at home, Richard had a strained relationship with his father, to say the least. And when Mr. Kuklinski passed, Richard admitted he was glad he died and refused to attend the funeral. Richard's relationship with his mother wasn't much better either. In one of his interviews, he shared that she would hit him with a broomstick whenever he did something wrong, which made him resentful. To make matters worse, Richard was frequently bullied because of his impoverished and immigrant background. With such an unhappy childhood, it's no wonder why Richard would go on to have no problem inflicting so much pain on his victims. After so many years of torment, and thanks to a much larger frame in puberty, Richard finally snapped and realized he could become the oppressor. On one occasion, after sustaining a particularly brutal beating, he returned to chase off his bullies with an iron bar. At this point, Richard realized he now had the power to make people flee and would never be a victim again. From that day, Richard developed a quick temper and would viciously attack people, often maiming them for a step out of line, a wrong look, or because he felt like it. By his early teens, Richard Kuklinski was already a murderer. He confessed to killing another teen, Charlie Chase, the gang leader that had been bullying him. After beating him to death with a wooden clothes bar, he covered his tracks by removing his victim's teeth and fingerprints and throwing the body off a bridge. If Richard felt any remorse after his first murder, it was obviously short-lived. Despite Richard's resentment for his, to put it mildly, rough upbringing, he'd adopted a violent nature he described as uncontrollable. Unlike Michael Shannon's portrayal of Richard Kuklinski in the 2012 crime movie The Iceman, things were much less rosy for the Kuklinski family. After years of watching his father physically abuse his mother and siblings, Richard went on to do the same to his wife and children. Richard told the interviewer that even though he loved his wife, he would forget when he got angry at her and lashed out, only to calm down and apologize fervently afterwards. On one particular occasion, Richard even admitted to handing his wife a knife on the night of a heated confrontation. "Take it," he said. "Here's a chance you'll never get again." He told her this and then turned his back. If Richard's wife had ended his life that night, perhaps that would have spared many of his future victims. His wife, Barbara Patrici, told police that Richard was much more volatile than his cinematic counterpart. Instead, he'd held her at knife point when she talked about ending the relationship and threatened to kill her and her family if she ever left him. With her 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, to think of, Barbara stayed put in her marriage. Of course, life in the Kuklinski family wasn't all thorns either. Richard made good money from his criminal activities as the head of a burglary ring, as a distributor of pirated pornography, and as a skilled hitman. He was genuinely committed to his family and said honestly in an interview that he would kill everyone present in the room without hesitation if it meant keeping them safe. His family understood that as long as they stayed in line and were lucky, Richard would continue to be a doting father and husband. However, considering he had a quick temper, broken noses and black eyes weren't uncommon. On an extreme occasion, he even murdered his daughter's dog as punishment for staying out late. Thankfully, the nature of his work would take him away for weeks, and Barbara and the kids didn't have to walk on eggshells all the time. As you can imagine, living with a man that tilted so easily between being loving and being violent must have been exhausting. Yet, despite his highly combustible rage and physical abusiveness, his family remained blissfully oblivious to his double life as a criminal. Eventually, Richard's violent tendencies got around, and he was recruited to join the American mob. With his giant 6'5" and 270-pound frame, a stature that earned him the nickname Big Richie, Richard was an asset to the mob bosses, especially because he enjoyed killing. In one of his exclusive HBO interviews, he said, "I would move heaven, earth, and hell if I was mad at you." His prolific skills as a killer made him a highly sought-after contractor in the underground world. Richard confessed to being contracted by criminal organizations like the Genovese, New York's Gambino family, and Newark's De Cavalcanti crime family, on which the popular series The Sopranos is based. Richard's unique and effective disposal methods made him a virtue to his employers. "If you pulled a gun on me, I would come forward. And if you don't kill me, you're stupid. Because the next time I see you, I will kill you," he said later on in the same interview. Amongst his peers, Richard Kuklinski would come to be known as the Devil himself for his creativity with his murder victims. Richard was well versed in how to kill people using different methods, including strangulating with his hands, battering with a hammer, or hacking away with a knife. He even admitted that one of his favorite ways to eliminate his targets was with a cyanide nasal spray because it was not as messy and also quicker. Besides, this method often misled officers to rule out foul play and conclude the person had had a heart attack. There was no limit to Richard's imagination. At some point, he even bought a crossbow and would kill random bums in New York City streets for sport. During one of his chilling interviews at Trenton State Prison, when asked how he felt about killing, he would answer, "It doesn't bother me at all. I don't have a feeling one way or the other." However, Richard Kuklinski would eventually pick up the nickname the Iceman for his clever method of storing his victims' bodies in freezers to mask the time of death. On one occasion, with law enforcement closing in on him and his colleagues, Richard killed 5 members of his gang and stored one of the men in an industrial freezer for over 2 years. Working for the mob could be dangerous, and Richard always tried to stay one step ahead of the authorities and other criminals by killing his so-called friends that could give him away. In another interview, Richard even admitted to killing one of his bosses, Roy DeMeo. However, members of DeMeo's crew have denied Richard's involvement in their operations, giving the impression that he wasn't always truthful in his interviews. Thus, the details of some of his murders remain sketchy, but there's plenty of evidence to convict him for many nefarious assassinations. After getting away with years of robberies and murders, Richard finally met his match in Special Agent Dominic Polifroni. In 1986, Dominic set up an undercover operation to catch Richard in the act by setting up a fake cyanide purchase. At the time, Richard had no idea Dominic was working with law enforcement and thought he was doing another job for a client. With his guard down, the agent was able to record Richard on the phone discussing sensitive details about the murder. Eventually, officers were able to catch him red-handed when he attempted to off the target Dominic Polifroni had set up. Finally apprehended, Richard Kuklinski was arrested on December 17, 1986, and held in a maximum security prison. After pleading guilty to the first-degree murder of his ex-gang members in March 1988, a court sentenced Richard to 2 consecutive life sentences in prison. He then served time in Trenton State Prison for 18 years, where he would partake in the HBO documentaries that immortalize his unremorseful attitude to his life of crime. Ironically, his younger brother, Joseph Kuklinski, was already serving a life sentence in the same prison for the rape and murder of a 12-year-old girl. Clearly, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. After battling Kawasaki disease, a condition that causes inflammation of the blood vessels for several years, Richard passed away on March 5, 2006. Although he was 70 years old at the time, there was some talk about foul play, considering he would have been an instrumental witness in an upcoming trial to prosecute the Gambino family's underboss, Sammy Gravano. It wasn't far-fetched that the Italian mafia had helped him to an early grave, just like Richard had done for countless victims. However, an autopsy determined Richard died of natural causes, and without sufficient evidence, the case against Sammy Gravano was dropped. Post-mortem, Richard Kuklinski's daughter admitted that although he had a formidable rage, she was shocked he had killed as many as 100 people. Despite Richard's far from empty threats to kill his wife and children, his daughter admitted to loving him still. "We wanted for nothing," she said, concluding that her father was a demented man and a victim of abuse that hadn't gotten the treatment he needed. Do you think Richard Kuklinski would have turned out differently if he'd had a different upbringing? Was he a victim of his circumstances or simply a man born evil? Let us know in the comments below. If you appreciated this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more true crime coverage. Thanks for watching, and see you soon in the next video.